Okay, here we go. Hi, my name is Chris DeBona, and you've come to Google and Open Source, a little talk I like to give at these talks. So I have sort of an unusual job at Google. It's sort of a job where I'm made responsible for the company's use of open source software, as well as being tasked with trying to make open source better and healthier and prolific. So we're going to talk about sort of how we go about doing these things and why we do them and why we like open source in the first place. One of the nice things about Google Developer Day is I get to see the practice of open source underpinning pretty much everything we do. Whenever you use an API example from the company, whenever you consider using that Android phone of yours, you're going to be using the output of a lot of software developers, but it's all going to be open source software, which gives you a remarkable amount of control and indeed control over your own software destiny, as I like to say. So I'm tasked with a couple of things at the company, including license compliance, making it easy for Googlers to release code into projects, and we also run something called the Summer of Code, and I'll talk about all of these things as we go. So the agenda, it's really quite simple. You're going to listen to me, and then questions, and that's it. Realistically, if you have any questions, we have a fellow here, Adrian, somewhere over there, who can translate them into English. Unfortunately, I don't understand Japanese. My apologies. Or you can wait till the end. It's really up to you. I love being interrupted because once you've given a talk like this often enough, you can give it sideways, you can give it on your head. But I'm mostly here to meet you and to answer your questions. So let me tell you about Google a little bit first. So this is Google. Whenever you go to Google, this is Google. No. When we started, this was Google. Larry and Sergey would go around their building, and they would find computers that were unplugged, and they would steal them. They put them in their lab. They would plug them into the network. And in a lot of ways, this was the last time Google was more than just Linux. It was Linux. It was the odd AIX system. It was the Sun machine. It was anything we could get our hands on. And this was where we did our first prototyping. But it was mostly Linux. And it was the last time we were heterogeneous. And then we went to this model of computing. I don't know that anyone's told you about this, but as you, 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, or 8 years ago, were buying hardware for your computers at home, whether they were disk drives, motherboards, power supplies, we were buying the exact same thing. While many of our competitors and other people in the industry were buying reliable hardware and similar sort of paraphernalia, we were like, well, reliable's nice, but having 3 times as much hard drive storage is better, even if it's going to fail twice as often. So we thought to ourselves, well, let's do this. Let's just go out and buy literally the crappiest stuff. I don't know how crappy translates. The crappiest stuff we can buy, so long as we have enough storage and enough CPU and enough memory to do what we need to do. Because doing web search takes a lot of power. But it doesn't really require reliability, except where it's exposed to you. And so we did that by basically understanding how to serve web pages reliably, even on terrible hardware. So that's what we did. And by the way, this stuff got hot. It was incredibly difficult to maintain. You would pull these trays out, because this is 4 computers in this 2U area. And you'd pull them out, and they would snag on the cables here, and they'd snap the cards off, just break right off. And this is not what most people consider high-end, well-thought-out computation. Of course, as we grew, we got better at it. We got more advanced cooling, more advanced power distribution, But realistically, this is the same thing. The same motherboards you were buying, the same hard drives you were buying, running the same Linux that you yourself could download and use. And we just kept on doing it and doing it. And this is sort of where we are today. This is kind of closer to where we are today. We did some we did some really remarkable YouTube videos about how we think of doing data centers. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, I urge you to go see them. This is not a green data center talk. This is not that kind of thing. But I want to explain that whenever Google tries to do something, we try to do something in such a way that it sort of mirrors what the rest of the world is doing with regards to cost control. So if we go and we buy a very specialized hard drive that nobody else is buying, it's going to be more expensive. Similarly, should we go and write our own operating system, our own compilers, our own libraries? No, of course not. We should use the ones that everyone else is using whenever that makes practical sense for us, whenever it's smart to do so, because it's ridiculous otherwise. Why would we want to redo things? So anyways, but first a little bit about open source. As you know, Google crawls this entire web of ours, and we find a lot of source code. So one day, I asked the folks in the code search team, I said, well, let's break it down by license. Let's figure out how much there is. So we de-uniqued it. We made sure we were only looking at the same thing. We weren't looking at duplicates. And we asked, OK, how many files are we finding? We're finding about 31 million files on the internet. And they're split evenly between the GPL and not GPL. So the whole point of this slide is to show you, even if the ideas behind open source are scary to you, what you really are probably afraid of is having to share your stuff when you don't want to. So if you got rid of the GPL, which is what scares some people, you're still left with somewhere over 1 billion lines of code. And if you get rid of the LGPL, because that's just weird, you know, and this is actually not a licenses talk, but I want you to understand how sometimes people think. If you get rid of the super scary ones, you're still left with almost 500 million lines of code. And that's pretty remarkable. Here, I'll go back to that, because people are like, wow, that's a great slide. So the point is, even if you don't want to understand these, if you want to give up, you know, a couple $1 trillion worth of software being just given to you, you know, and you just want to stick over here, that's great. There's still so many programs out there that you can use for your software. And this informed exactly, this and this next slide here, this informed exactly how we structured how Google does open source inside the company. Because I didn't want, you know, our 8,000, 9,000 software engineers to have to rewrite everything. You know, nobody does. It's ridiculous. We want them to write new things for people to enjoy, for us to use in the crawl, for us to use when we index the internet. Right? We want them not to have to rewrite everything. So the question becomes, well, why does all this software even exist at all? And should the motivations of those people dictate how Google uses open source? And I think it should, and it does. So you'll see up here, we just want to be smarter. We want to be better computer scientists. And that means just understanding how software works. And this is actually what motivated 10,000 different people that we asked in open source software back in 2001. We went to the site SourceForge. We asked 10,000 project leaders why they do what they do. And these are the boxes they ticked off, and at the rate at which they ticked them off. So, you know, they wanted to get smarter. They wanted to be better at computer science. They wanted to not wake up at 3 in the morning to fix their computer. You know, and a lot of them just wanted to share back. So they had learned so much from the world of open source that they too wanted to contribute. And down here, they didn't like Microsoft. So, no, it's funny, you know. But if you think about it, it's only 1 in 10. This is great, you know. 89%, okay, 88.9% of the people, they weren't motivated by hate. They were motivated by love and by wanting to be smarter. And I thought that was a very, very good thing. And it's something that I'd always felt. So I love computers. And sometimes, I have to be honest with you, I wouldn't care if I was still using CPM or some incredibly ancient operating system. As long as it's a computer, I'm pretty happy. I love computers. I don't hate anything about computers. And so seeing this just makes me really, really happy. Because for me, open source is about all of us working together. It's not about us, you know, kicking anybody, you know. So what does this mean? It means that people in open source understand licenses. They pick them. They pick them to match their ideals. And that's really important. Most of them, almost all of them, no, they're giving away work to you. They want to. They want computer science to get better. They want to be part of open source. They know that you're going to use it. It's very, very rare for people to not make the connection between releasing open source software and somebody else using it. It does happen, and it's a little crazy, but it does happen, but it's very rare. And most of them aren't in it for the money. They already have a job. They have a job that's maybe encouraging open source participation, but they have a job that's better because of open source. And that's all pretty remarkable. So that's great. So how do we use it? Why? Who cares about open source at Google? So let me explain. Whenever you go to Google, you're using a machine that's running Linux. And then there's some system libraries, and then it's running software. That software is built using open source compilers with open source languages, Java, C++, Python. And then that software that Googlers write is combined with libraries that we find all over the internet that are open source, whether it's OpenSSL, zlib, whatever. We use it all over the place. We also use tools to help us manage our systems, those crazy computers you saw earlier. And finally, we use it on our desktops. So we're using open source throughout the entire production of Google. Literally, every time you're using Google, you're using Linux, you're using a ton of open source software. So that's great. Yay us, you know. But why? So to illustrate this, I want to tell you a story. If you go back about 6 years, France Telecom, the cell phone provider in France, they decided they wanted to introduce a new feature, and this was push-to-talk. So do you have push-to-talk here in Japan? It's an unusual feature, but it's used, you see it used in construction sites and sort of those sorts of work groups, where basically it turns your cell phone into a walkie-talkie, you know, and then you speak into it and it comes out of all the cell phones that are on that network. Not all of them, obviously, but just the ones, say, on your construction sites, your pals, whatever. So they wanted to introduce this feature because they thought it was very compelling. So you go, doop, 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 you know, talk to your friends instantly. You don't have to dial anything, you don't have to do anything. So unfortunately, this means they had to spend a fair amount of money upgrading their carrier infrastructure. So they spent about $2 billion on this. It took about 2 years. Meanwhile, they had allocated a couple of phones to come out that would take advantage of this feature. It was a very big deal to them. And they sourced a really nice phone, and they were going to run Windows Mobile on it. And this is not an anti-Microsoft talk. It might sound like it for the next 5 minutes, but it's not. It's like a little translator lag there. Anyway, so they were getting closer and closer to launch. They were about 4 months out. And they noticed that every fifth died, fell on the floor. Toast. And they're like, well, that's no good. And so their engineering staff, they found where they felt in the operating system this was happening. They located the shared library in the operating system where they felt this failure was occurring. And they called up their customer representative at Microsoft. They said, hey, we've got a problem. And they said, oh no, what is it? Well, every fifth call, it's dying. I said, oh, that's no good. But we know all about that. And they're like, oh, good, good, good. And we fixed it. Oh, even better. Magnifique. This is great. And they said, well, can we have the fix? And they said, well, it's in the next version of the operating system. Oh, that sounds good. Well, when's that coming out? 18 months from now. But we have to ship in 4 months. Well, I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do about that. And I don't know how many of you are in organizations that ship software to customers. But one of the things that is true is you have to make that decision. You have to say, how much is this customer worth to me? Is it worth creating a whole new branch of my software, a whole new section of my support queues to satisfy this one customer? And at the time, France Telecom was about 5% of Windows Mobile business. And they made the logical decision that it was too expensive to give them the fix for that version, and that they'd have to wait. Now, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying that at that point, if France Telecom could have said, well, listen, we know where the error is. We can fix it and ship it out ourselves. They would have. They would have said, wow, we spent $2 billion, or however much that was in francs at the time. We spent all this money. We had this phone coming out. Let's just fix it. But they didn't have the option to do that because they didn't control their software. And this is something that Google never, ever wants to be in, this situation is not, it's the kind of thing that gives us the willies, right? Makes us very nervous. So, if you look at about the same time, we had a problem with the Linux kernel. We wanted programs that were not root, that were not privileged, to be able to use ports that are under 1,000. Now, we didn't have to go and ask anyone's permission to fix it. We fixed it, we pushed out the change, it took us about a week. We didn't have to tell a vendor how many CPUs we had. We didn't have to tell the vendor how many threads we wanted to support. We didn't have to tell a vendor where they were, what countries they were going to. We didn't have to give up any of that information that we're not really all that comfortable sharing, because we had control of our software. And this is very, very important to realize about Google. If you look on our production networks, whether it's MySQL, the different languages we use, libraries like OpenSSL, nowhere in there, nowhere in any of the open source licenses that say, then you must call up that developer and tell them how you're using it. And this is something that is core to who we are. We really like developing and iterating and pushing out new versions, and we do it all the time. And we don't have to stop and say, but what would Oracle say? What would Sun say? What would Microsoft say? And even better, when we do make our decisions, the people who have said they do not like us very much in the marketplace don't have a say in how we deploy our software. And that's very, very important. And finally, another reason we use open source is a lot of us came from the world of open source. And so we want to make sure that we're able to continue using it. It's for us how we do computer science. So we could stop there. This talk, we could be done. We use open source and like it. Big deal, right? But we think it's more important to not stop there. We think it's important to continue from there and actually have a role in where open source goes. And so we have a number of programs designed specifically for that. The most important currency, in my mind, in open source is the release of source code. Google releases now about a new project every week, smaller project every week. More often than not, those are developer-oriented tools. Our very first release from the company were 4 tools that were fairly dense. They were our memory allocation libraries, our thread management libraries, and a variety of other very sort of computer science-y things. And we actually picked those intentionally because we wanted to send a message that we weren't just sending out API examples. Although I'm very, very happy that our API examples are open source, they kind of don't exist without us. But there's a lot of things we've released, plugins for Eclipse, tools that work with repositories, Git repositories, and things like that, that can exist even if Google does not. And so they're very much pure in my mind. They're a little purer. Anyway, we released our linker. We released all kinds of changes to GCC. And we've released patches around MySQL that I think are incredibly compelling to help you if you have to replicate MySQL databases the way that we do. So this is the fundamental sort of action of a company in open source. A lot of people like to say they're very friendly to open source, that they like open source. But really, for me, the code that's released says the most about how a company interacts with open source software and the developers who make it. So we also have very, very large projects. So my group mostly works with small projects and large projects. Large projects get a lot of our attention. And small projects, it's a little easier because we do them all the time, and it sort of keeps the wheels greased of release. So for instance, one of our first very large projects was Google Web Toolkit. As you know, how many of you develop web pages for a living? Just raise your hand. There's 1, 2, yeah. So there's probably more of you too, translator lag. Well, one of the problems that we've had is trying to support that very last browser. Whether it's some version of Safari, IE6, some version of Firefox, Chrome even, right? Where everything else is working for every other browser except for this one. And the standard isn't moving forward fast enough for everyone to get on the same page here. And so we're like, well, how do we solve this problem? Well, a team in Atlanta, their solution was a fairly clever toolkit, which you may have heard about today, that makes things fast, safe, and cross-browser. And you can code it all up in Eclipse. A lot of people really like that, and that's pretty exciting. So this is about 3 years ago. And then the other problem we had was that JavaScript was really, really flippin' slow. And so we thought, well, how could we fix this problem? Who is prioritizing JavaScript speed? Turns out kind of no one was. So a number of years ago, we spun up the Chrome project, which is based on the open source Chromium project out of the company. And the whole point of this was to create a safe, fast browsing experience. And again, this was about 1 million lines of code, give or take. Probably a bit more now. And it allows basically us to forward the web. And we could have just created a browser and released it like everybody else at the time. We didn't have to open source it. But the stated goal of the project was to move the web forward, to make possible these desktop-like AJAX interfaces in such a way that wasn't incredibly slow and as likely to take down the entire browser as not. So we felt that to actually be honest about that mission, we had to open source it. So now anyone can take the JavaScript renderer. And by anyone, I mean Microsoft, I mean Apple, I mean Firefox. They can just take it and use it. They can learn from it. They can just use the code. We're providing it to them completely free, and also free of intellectual property concerns. So it's pretty remarkable. And then finally we said, okay, what's another area that really stinks to develop for? And I don't know how many of you have had to develop for cell phones. It's probably a bit easier in Japan. But the reality was, if you look across the smartphone market, you know, you've got 65% Symbian, 20% Windows, and then a hodgepodge, and now you have some iPhone, about 5%. And we said, listen, there's no reason why these cell phone operating systems have to stink like this. And so we released Android to answer that. How can we bring sort of the fairness and the freeness that allowed us to be successful on the internet? How can we bring that ethic to cell phones? And so Android was our answer. And we think it's a pretty good answer. So. And then we said to ourselves, okay, email sucks. Or it's not optimal. And so we thought of ways of fixing it, and we came up with Google Wave. Now, we could have stopped just implementing Google Wave, much like Gmail actually, and just have it exist on the Google network, have it serve Google customers and do that well. We could have stopped there. But we chose instead to go a little further. We've already released the protocols. In about 3 weeks, we should have the first bits of code coming out so that people can start federating out, so that it's not just Google Wave, but everyone's Wave, so that we can share this kind of communication tool, even if you're not Google, if you're an ISP, if you're just an enthusiast with a server at home, if you're a company, so that anyone can start sharing waves across work groups, across companies, across countries, and so it can really grow the way that it needs to. So that's Wave. And then this is the kind of thing that almost never gets anyone noticing it unless you're on the individual teams. But we patch like crazy. So our kernel team is always patching into the Linux kernel. And by kernel team, I mean both the Android kernel team and our production kernel team. Our compiler teams are constantly releasing into GCC. And then we have individual Googlers who just care about different projects. And this is just a sampling. We've released into literally hundreds of different projects, small patches, bug fixes, feature improvements, you name it. And in some ways, this is the most important thing we do. It's very likely, no matter what you do with your computer or your cell phone or whatever, you're using some Google code that came out of these practices. And that's something we're very proud of, actually. So. And then finally, if you look back about 5 years, the world really only had one large-scale, reliable host for open source projects, SourceForge. And we were a little nervous about that. We felt that to have all of open source's eggs in one basket, as it were, wasn't a very good idea. Now we're very lucky. We have Google Code, we have SourceForge, we have GitHub, we have a really good milieu, collection of different hosting alternatives that people can use. And so it's been very successful. We have about 240,000 registered projects, of which I'd say about 60,000 are active, meaning a commit every 6 days or so, or more. So, and we offer all the basics, wikis, bug tracking, file hosting, you name it. This is funny because it seems like every company I go to has to do this, because I was at SourceForge back in the day. But it's actually very, very important. When we started Google Code, we had the same sort of ethic. We have to preserve the history of source code for us to understand where we've come from, so we can track down the worst of the bugs, and so we can maintain compatibility with systems going forward. And it's remarkably important. Another problem that we had is we perceived that there weren't enough open source developers. We would go to conferences and we'd see many of the same people. And so our dilemma was, how do we create new ones? And at the same time, Google co-founder Larry Page had wanted computer science students to do computer science over the summer, as opposed to working in a restaurant or whatever they would do to make money. And so we brought these two together, these two desires together, and we created the Summer of Code. The Summer of Code is actually quite simple. Suppose you're a student in a university, or really just over 18 years old. You would apply to take part in a project, whether it was Apache, Python Software Foundation, whichever. We have 150 organizations to choose from. A mentor from the Apache Software Foundation would review your application. If it's good enough, they may accept you. If you're accepted, you're paid a small fee, $500 US, and then you work with that mentor on your project. And these projects are really important, not because they're open source, although that's very nice. But when you're a computer science student, I don't know how many of you were, but you'll remember it's largely in the realm of theory and the theoretical. So you don't see user problems. You don't see problems like you encounter when you port from one platform to another, or when somebody with a completely bizarre client uses your software. And open source sees these kinds of bugs all the time. And so by taking part in this kind of a program, the student gets exposed to sort of the nitty-gritty of programming and of computer science. I think that's very, very important. And if they're successful, midway through the project, they get paid $2,000. And if they should finish, they'll get another $2,000. And this is all judged by the mentoring organization, say Apache or Python or whoever. And if you're successful, you get a T-shirt as well, because clothes are very important. People are naked before they come into this project. Not really, but yeah. So the important thing to realize about this is like open source, it's very much a merit-based program. If people don't do the work, they don't get paid. They get thrown out. We fail 1 out of every 5 students. It's very competitive, but it's also very honest and true to what I consider the nature of open source software. I've always considered open source as being very merit-based. And if you really think about software and how open source is actually different from proprietary software and commercial software development, you find out very, very quickly one thing that happens in open source differently than proprietary software is that people leave or are kicked out a lot. And when they leave or are kicked out, they'll often start competing projects, sometimes with the code of their project they're leaving with or from. And that's very, very different. You don't see that as often in the proprietary world. And so we wanted to encourage the kicking out process and make people realize that this was an option. And so people had to perform if they wanted to be successful in the project. So this year we have 1,000 students taking part, 150 organizations, about 2,000 mentors from these organizations. And this is really amazing because students get to work with real computer scientists, often fairly remarkable ones too. We had about 6,000 applications in this year, of which we accepted 1,000 people. And we had them come from 79 different countries. It's a global program. People stay in their country. They don't come to Google or anything. They do it remotely. Because that's another thing that open source does better than pretty much everything else, and that's in distributed development. And so we want to encourage that by keeping people in their basements, in their schools, at their homes, whatever. And last year, we made about 3 million lines of code, which means that for the 3 months that the Summer of Code goes, it's the most effective software development organization on the planet. So that's the overview. And then I'd really like to go on to Q&A while we have some time. And I love answering any questions about Google, pretty much at all, but open source specifically. So there's one right here. You might want to stay near them. Go ahead. Speak up.
How do you decide what particular license you use?
Sure. So the question is, how do we select the license that we release software under? In the case of patches, that's easy. It's just whatever license that project is using. It would be ridiculous for us to try to put, a kernel patch under something other than the GPL, for instance. We usually try to pick the license that's best for the software. And often, that means BSD or Apache. So 99% of our releases are under the Apache or BSD license. And for those of you who aren't licensed dorks like me, that means you take the code, you can have it, you can do basically whatever you want with it. Commercial, open source, doesn't matter. And then even if it's BSD licensed, we also usually give a patent non-assert taken from the Apache license with it. And what that says is that any patents that we might have over the technology, that Google might have over the technology that we're releasing, are also being released to you and your users, and so on and so forth. And the reason we do that is because we want to make it very, very clear the relationship that we're having with developers. Most of the time when Google releases software, it's so that people can just take the software and run with it. And so we usually don't do the GPL, unless it makes sense to do so, in the case of the kernel and GCC and other projects like that. But that said, even though most of the time it's Apache and BSD, we've released under the GPL, the LGPL, the CPL, CDDL, SCSL, you name it, we've probably released under it. But most of the time we prefer BSD and Apache. The nice thing about BSD and Apache also is they're consumable by other licenses. If you release something under the BSD license, pretty much any software project can consume it. And with Apache, pretty much any modern license can consume it, whether it's GPL v3 or others. So that's why we do that.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the Android open source project and how those releases
You need to speak up so the interpreter can hear you.
No, I'll repeat his question. It's okay.
So you'll see different releases like Cupcake,
Sure.
whatever, and I'd like to know how those releases
Sure.
structured and how we can use them.
Okay. So the question is, how do we structure the release of Android? And Android's a fairly unusual project. I mean, so most of the releases that we do from the company are actually quite small compared to Android. Android is a collection of 134 Git repositories that are brought together by the repo system, and then you download it and can build your images and other parts of the software. It's really, really hard to answer your question, but I'm going to try. So the first release we did was the easy one. It's like, poof, here's the code, right? And then what happened was we have sort of these major releases, Cupcake, and then eventually Donut, and so on and so forth. And so you have a little flurry of activity between, and then we brought out Cupcake, which was, I think, 5.5 million lines of code change from the initial release to Cupcake. And so that's really hard for people to understand, to bring into their software, and the rest. And it's not ideal, right? So in an ideal world, we'd be able to do every patch all the time in the open. And if you look at some of the repositories, we do that. The kernel, Bionic, the libc, and some other parts. And clearly the tools like Repo and Garrett. So our goal in the team has been to make those huge point releases get closer and closer and closer across all the repositories. And we're getting to be a bit more successful at that. The real problem is that you think of, well, I'm imposing a thought stream on you, I apologize for that. You think of maybe as Android as being this open source project in Google. But it's more than that. It's Google and a chipset vendor who hasn't released their chip yet, so they want to hold off their release until the chip's released. It's Google and a carrier And most of the work can be open source, except for this one part that the carrier is saving for when they want to release. And then it'll be one chipset vendor and another carrier by themselves, and maybe they'll never release their changes. And then you'll have like this off-brand non-OHA member who's taken this code, and then they release code maybe on their site or not at all, right? So this is actually why we ended up choosing Git, by the way, as our revision control system that supports this kind of craziness. But our goal as a company has been to get that code coming out as fast as possible, at least from us. And we also act as a conduit for some of the other OHA members who aren't as comfortable with releasing source code themselves. So we try to act as their agent in some ways. And so what happens, though, if you're consuming this code, it can be hard because you end up getting these, these big boluses, these big chunks of code. And all I'll say is that over time, it will get better, because it has been. But it's hard sometimes. So that's sort of what you're seeing from the inside. That's what sort of creates what you're seeing.
Just a follow-up to that. So, for example, you have the cupcake release, and then in some of the repository, you see some references to Donut.
Yeah.
Can you take that, the stuff that's in Donut, create your images with whatever's in Donut?
So the question was, and you're already starting to see in some of the repositories references to Donut and functionality that Donut needs. And yet you still want to build your image and not have it be crap. So I think I answered your question right. And so the answer is, unfortunately, sometimes if you take a snapshot, including the mixture of Donut and Cupcake, some things won't work very well. So this is sort of one of the things that's required of the people who want to use Android, is understanding how to pull those repositories in such a way that you can have a buildable image. And I'm not going to say it's easy right now, because it's not. I mean, you can just say, well, I'm going to stick with the Cupcake point release and stay there. And then, maybe I'll integrate things as I feel comfortable with them. That's sort of what I've seen some integrators doing. Other people, they come to the OHA, and they work with one of the chipset vendors directly, or with Google directly, and then we set up contracts and all that other stuff. But we wanted to make sure that the code keeps on getting released. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes it'll get a little out of sync with each other as it gets more granular. And we're still figuring out as a company how to do that better. So, we released the first release of Android in October, and it's, May? June? So we're learning, and it's a little painful right now, so my apologies. So, sure.
Thanks for the presentation. I understand that Google is really contributing to the open source projects, but the interesting thing is that now I understand Google is making and giving patches to open source projects, but we cannot fix bugs of Google projects hosted by Google, like AdWords or Gmail or something like that.
Sure.
So my question is, do you have any plan to open source those Google hosted projects?
So we released like little cutouts that came out of Android and Gmail, but the larger answer is no. We don't have a plan to open source Gmail or the ads products. And that's kind of the fault of the company. So when we've created these things, they have their tendrils into all of these fairly crazy storage, backend, and data center systems. So it's very, very hard for us to open source them without open sourcing everything, and that would take a very long time. So unfortunately, the only answer if you find a bug with Gmail or with any of the products that aren't open source is to email support. And in that, we're no different than any other company. So, and this is actually why Wave for me is a very big success, right? Because we know that we're going to be open sourcing everything. It's going to be not unlike Android. If you find a bug, even if you have no desire to fix the bug yourself, you can find out where it is, you can report it. It's very understood. And it creates sort of this super user way of interacting with the project, a developer way. So, yeah. But unfortunately, we don't have that for Gmail or AdWords.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone? Oh, up there.
Is there any part of Google Wave that will not be open sourced?
So the problem with Google Wave open sourcing is that at some point Google Wave touches those parts of Google infrastructure that make Gmail hard to open source. And so what we've done is we're architecting a layer that it goes through. So this stuff won't be open sourced. But for instance, your storage backend, whether it'll be MySQL or whatever, we're still figuring a lot of this out. That will go in that spot, right? So maybe you won't be able to scale to, say, 2 billion users or 1 million users. But the architecture that you've created to do that scaling, that's where you would plug that in. So when you think about what won't be released, we're trying to make that components smaller and smaller and smaller so that it's not a problem. And that's been a lot of the work that my team and the Wave team has been doing over the last many months.
But what will the dependency on Google be like in the foreseeable future?
Well, in the foreseeable future, well, I mean, there's this real question about federation, right? So one of the big problems with spam on the internet is that ISPs and VeriSign seem happy to keep on giving these people domain names and IP addresses, right? So fixing spam has been very, very difficult. And we don't want to have a spam problem on Google Wave, and yet we want to federate it, meaning anyone can run one and they can communicate with each other. So that's a good question. I don't know how you can have one without too much control, but that's actually not a software question. Software-wise, we can give the software away. You know, we can make it possible for anyone to run a Wave server. The question is, can you run a Wave server that talks to my Wave server and back and forth? And that's an area where we're still trying to figure it out. If you look at the federation, on waveprotocol.org, we have a document about federation where we're trying to approach this problem. And if you want to pitch in, that's a great place to pitch in. So I sort of take the attitude that I don't know that the spam problem is fixable, ever. So yeah, but we'll see. You know, there are people more optimistic than me. We'll take 1 or 2 more questions. There's a fellow over there on the right-hand side. Stage right, I guess.
But I'm wondering about sort of whether there are examples or in terms of company policy of opening up that thought process or that design process to a lot of things rather than just opening up code once it's hit a good milestone. And if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, other than Android, we actually, like for instance, if you look at Chrome, they open source every single, change list. So that's an ongoing effort on the outside. Same thing with Google Web Toolkit. Android in some ways is the unusual one. In my mind, Google Web Toolkit does it very, very well because they even post their meeting minutes every week to the open source site. So they've done a remarkable job at really exposing their practices to the outside world. And that's hard for some groups to do because they're not comfortable with that kind of openness. They want to sort of like not be that exposed. We're seeing some of that in Google Wave right now on the protocol list and the discussion list there, where we're trying to do as much as we can there, but we're just getting started there. I don't know if that's what you mean, though, by expose our process, and I don't know if you mean compliance either. So.
No, that's the question I had, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, open source release, it's funny because the individual small releases I mentioned in the talk, those are usually much easier to get a handle on, meet the team, and interact with them at a technical level than the larger projects. Android is the most complicated of all the big projects. Google Web Toolkit's the most accessible, and Chrome is sort of in between, right? They are certainly exposed enough. You can watch everything that goes on, but you probably don't have as much insight into the strategic direction of the project. So it's really a spectrum, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I don't think that'll ever change. I think that there'll be some that are, remarkably open, and others that aren't so much. So. And I'm being told we're out of time. So I'll take one more question. So, anything? Oh, there's one in the back. We'll do it really quick. And then we'll clear out for the next speaker. They're like, what are you doing?
日本語でいいです。すみません。スピーチありがとうございます。で、オープンソースに対してGoogle がどれだけ貢献しているか、あとどういう意気込みでやっているかっていうのはよく分かったんですが、例えば今現在の Google の、ビジネスモデル、広告で、ビジネスをやっていると思いますが、それがもし、成り立たなくなった時にオープンソースをやめて別のソースを売るだとかサービスで課金をしていくっていうようなことは何か想定していたりしますか？
What will happen if that happens? So the question is, if Google implodes and stops making money and can't pay people anymore, what will happen to the open sourcing end of things? Honestly, I have no clue because they'll probably fire me if we run out of money. But seriously, so the nice thing about open source and about the projects that we release is we can't take them back, you know? You could go right now, you can mirror everything we do on some website, and we can never, ever take them back. This is the really nice thing about open source. And when we created our services, with the exception of the infrastructure where we're providing hosting, I mean, Google could literally go away tomorrow, and all of those projects will still be there. And that's satisfying, you know? That said, do I think that Google's attitude on open source will change? I don't, so long as I'm there, it won't, because I'm kind of a jerk. But I think so long as Larry, Sergey, and Eric remain, and people like them remain, people like Bill Corrin and some of the other VPs that I know, I think we're going to be fine. Because we understand the value of Google is actually not so much the software all the time. We're not really a software company. Google is an advertising company. And so long as that's true, and so long as we make money from the internet, you know, we see the improvement of that internet as being core to the mission of the company. And the way you do that, in my mind, is through open source. So I'd say just make sure I don't get fired, you know. That might be good for me. But past that, you know, there's no answer. I can't predict the future. I mean, maybe Google will become terrible. But it would take a lot, actually, of change for that to happen. Googlers have become used to open sourcing things. They've become used to it being easy. And that's the kind of thing that's very, very hard to change, because the engineers at Google still do run things, and will for a very long time. So there you go. I have to go up the room, so thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be outside.